All right, this is your recording for lesson 36-2 called Another Measure of Variability. If you haven't already, please turn in your book to page 532, and we will eventually need your graphing calculators also, so if you don't have that out, you should probably get that out as well. So things that we're going to be learning in this lesson, you can see some of them up here on your targets. We're going to use what is called summation and subscript notation, which is going to make us look like super fancy math people. Then we are going to calculate and interpret the standard deviation of a numerical data set. And we are going to select appropriate measures of spread by examining the shape of a distribution. I am going to add a learning target in here as well, and that is to use a TI 83 or 84 to calculate one variable statistics. Okay, so we have already learned how to calculate the mean by hand as well as the mean absolute deviation or the MAD score. And so we're going to be reviewing that before we get into some of the new pieces of information as well. So as we look here, it says consider the following data from CNET, a tech media website that publishes information about technology and consumer electronics. These data are taken from a review of cell phone battery lifetimes. The table below gives the talk time in hours for the top 10 brands of batteries. So you have 10 different data points here representing the top 10 brands, and again, it's talk time in hours. So first thing we want to do is to calculate the mean. And then in number 2, it wants us to find the mean absolute deviation using the table. So mean, hopefully you are saying in your head that you know that that means we're going to add them all up and divide by 10. So that's exactly what we're going to do here. So in your graphing calculator, you're going to take each of these 10 values and we're going to add them together. So 19.78 plus 14.55. So I'm not going to read them all out loud. Obviously, you can see them there that we're adding together. So there I've got 5 more to go. Oops, sorry, my little pen thing slipped there. That's an 11. Make sure that when you're entering a longer list of data in your calculator that you scroll back through and check it. So once you've added all 10 of those up, hopefully you come up with 125.68. And so then when we divide that by 10, that's going to give us a mean of about 12.568, and our label would be hours. So that's our mean. Complete the table below by finding the absolute values of the deviations. So remember that whenever we're calculating the MAD score, what I had said in class is that it's like we read the acronym backward. So we find the deviation first, then we take the absolute value of it, and then we take the mean of those. So always reading backward here. So remember that deviation is where we start, and what that is the difference between the actual value and the mean. So here, 19.78 is the value. To get this deviation, we subtracted the mean. So 19.78 minus 12.568. So I'm going to give you just a couple minutes here to calculate each of these within your small group. So make sure that everybody's double checking each other. Don't just, take one person's word for it. Make sure you check, but go ahead, and this does say absolute value of the deviation. So remember that if you get a negative number, it's going to become positive in the column. So I'm going to just give you some wait time here while you do that. You can pause the video, and then when you are done filling out the table, unpause it and we'll check your answers. All right, so to double check, make sure that you subtracted well. We've got 14.55 minus the 12.58. We should get 1.982 here. When I switch to the 13.4, I get 0.832. Then 0.182 and 0.568. Second column, again, they did the first one for you there. So 10.7 minus 12.568 gives us 1.868. The 10.6 is only a tenth different, so 1.968. Obviously, that repeats here since they were the same value. And then finally, 10.3 gives me 2.268. So I found the deviations. I took their absolute values because, again, down here, anything that's smaller than the mean would be negative, but we make it positive with the absolute value. And then in number 3 is that we need to find the mean of the 10 absolute deviations. So we're going to take all of these and we're going to add them up. So add all 10 of these in your calculator. Giving you a little time to enter it. So enter away. You should, on that one, when you add all 10 of those, get a total of 20.416. And so since there are 10, when I divide by 10, I get 2.0416. So that is our MAD score here. All right, turn the page. And now we are going to start addressing that summation notation, learning target. And the reason that we do that is because the most common, it says another common, but I would say the most common measure of variability is called the standard deviation. One of the most important calculations in statistics. So before you can understand how to calculate a standard deviation by hand, you have to understand what's called summation notation. So it starts with the Greek letter sigma. You'll notice one of the posters in my room has a sigma on it. So now you know what that means. It's the Greek letter sigma, but what it does, it indicates that you're supposed to find the sum. So we kind of read it sum of. So here, this sigma with the i's and the 5, we would read that the sum of the values of I, because that's what's here, as I goes from 1, because that's on the bottom, to 5, because that's on the top. So they've broken it down very nicely for you. They've shown you what this particular summation would equal. So I starts at the bottom value and it ends at whatever the top value is. Now, it doesn't have to be just I over here. We can write anything we want there. So here they did an example where it would be I plus 2. So if we're taking the summation of I plus 2 as I goes from 3 to 6, that means the first thing we do is plug in 3, and then we add, because it's a summation, when we plug in 4, and we add that to when we plug in 5, and we add that to when we plug in 6. We stop at the top number. So we are just going to look at a couple of these sums here to make sure that you understand how to do those. So here we have the sum of the values of I squared as I goes from 1 to 4. So what that means here is that I'm going to plug in 1 for I first. So that, of course, gives me 1 squared. And because it's a summation, I'm going to add that to the next term, which would be when I is 2. So 2 squared plus, keep going, when I is 3. This becomes 3 squared. And I stop when I is 4. So my last part of the summation is going to be the 4 squared. So then I just simplify. I'm adding all these together. So 1 plus 4 plus 9 plus 16. And when I add all 4 of those together, I get 30. So 30 is the value of this summation. All right, I would like for you in your groups to try the last one, part C. So you're going to be starting at I equals 2, ending at I equals 7, and using this as the value that you're plugging into. So again, go ahead and pause the recording for a moment while you work, and then unpause it when you are finished. All right, so let's check your work here. Starting with 2, so absolute value of 5 minus 2 is my first term. I add it to, then I go up to 3, so 5 minus 3 plus 5 minus 4 plus absolute value 5 minus 5. Ran out of room because I wrote too big. 5 minus 6 in absolute values, and then the last term is going to be the 7. So now I just simplify. Absolute value of 5 minus 2 is 3. 5 minus 3 is 2. Absolute value of that is 2. 5 minus 4 is 1. 5 minus 5 is 0. Then when I go to 5 minus 6, it's negative 1, but because of the absolute values, it's positive 1. And then this guy would be negative, but I've got the absolute value that cancels that. So then add these together, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So my summation there is equal to 9. All right, so I bet that if I had shown you this formula before we ever calculated a MAD score, that you probably wouldn't have even given it a chance because it looks really complicated. You wouldn't have known what X bar meant. You wouldn't have known what the sigma meant, and it would have been very intimidating. So we learned to calculate the MAD score just by doing one little step at a time, which is really what we also do for the standard deviation. And the summation just means that we're adding all of them up. So this is the formula for calculating standard deviation. It's a little more involved, and it's got advanced statistical settings here. We can calculate the standard deviation using our calculator also, which is going to be helpful, and I will show you how to do that here momentarily. So we are going to calculate both the MAD and the standard deviation with just 4 pieces of data, because the more pieces of data you have, the longer it takes to find these things. You could see how long it took us to find the MAD on the previous page, and standard deviation takes a little longer than that. So we're starting with just 4 of the battery times. So 7 hours, 10 hours, 8.1 hours, 9.32 hours, and it tells us up front that the mean of those observations is 8.605, which we will need. So if you look at the top of the next page, we've got a table to complete. So they reminded us of the mean, 8.605, and they gave us each of the data points. So the first thing that we need to do in order to get the MAD and or standard deviation is to do those individual deviations. So I'm going to take the 7, subtract the 8.605, and then take the absolute value. So when I do that, I get 1.605. This next one, notice that the inside of the parentheses is the same as the inside of the bars, but then it wants me to square it. Now, because squaring something is always going to give you a positive result, you don't need to worry about the fact that the absolute value changes the sign. We can just take this value and square it here. So in your calculator, you can just press in 1.605 and your squared key, and that's going to give us what goes here. So if we do 2.576 approximately, and then move on to the next score. So 10 minus 8.605 gives me 1.395. Then when I take that and square it, I get 1.946. Then 8.1 minus 8.605, which gives me, after the absolute value, gives me this. When I square that, I get 0.255 approximately. And the last one, so subtract first and take the absolute value, should be 0.715. Then when I square that, I get 0.511 approximately. So the next thing it asks is for us to do the sums, the summation. So it asks us to find the summation of x subscript I, that's what that is, x sub I is sometimes how we read it. So these are the x sub i's, and I changes from 1, 2 to 3 to 4. So from I equals 1 to 4, summation of x sub I just means add these 4 things together. So that would be 34.42. Here, because what's over on this side is exactly what's up here, and it's from I equals 1 to 4, that just means add all these guys up. So when you add these 4 values in your calculator, double check me, but I think you should get 4.22. Over here, same idea. This is equivalent to the title of our column, so when I'm doing the summation, it just means to add these 4 totals together. So that gives us 5.288 approximately. So the mean absolute deviation, the MAD score, what we would get is taking that sum, so adding all these up, and dividing by how many there were, which was 4. So that's going to be 4.22 divided by 4, which gives us about 1.055. The standard deviation, notice it's a little more complicated. We're going to have to do this in steps because it's got a square root over the entire thing. So I'm going to copy that square root. My numerator is this guy, so 5.288. The denominator is n minus 1, and n is the number of data items, so 4 minus 1, which is 3. So you can do this one of 2 ways. You can either type in your square root symbol first and then put parentheses or use your fraction button, or you can just do 5.288 divided by 3 and then do the square root of that answer. Either way, we should get a value here of 1.328. So we have calculated the MAD score and the standard deviation both by hand here. Now, as we look at number 6, it wants us to do the exact same thing for a new set of 3 data pieces here. So this time we're talking about 3 data points that represent the weight in ounces of 3 newborns. So A asks you for the mean. Then you're going to calculate the MAD, that's this column is helping you to get the MAD, which is down here. This, remember, this says W bar, which is the same thing as X bar. It's just that since we were using W here. So this is the mean. So it just wants you to write it in all of those columns. And then this is going to help us get the standard deviation. So you're doing the exact same thing that we did up here in 5. So you've got your 3 data points here. After you calculate your mean, those are going to go in this column. And then you do just like we did up here, same exact steps. So this should probably take you about 5 minutes with your group. So again, you're going to need to pause the recording because I want you to take your time, because it's not nearly as good to watch me do it as it is for you to do it yourself. So you need to be working on this in your groups. So take about 5 minutes to come up with your values for the MAD and the standard deviation, and then unpause the recording again. All right, so checking your work, computing the mean, that means we're just going to add them up. And in this case, since there's only 3 data points, we're going to divide it by 3. So our W bar, as they're calling it this time, is 120 ounces. So that means that I put 120 in all of those columns. Here, the summation down at the bottom, when I add these 3 together, I get 360. In preparation for the MAD, I take the individual data minus the mean. So 120 minus 120 is 0. 115 minus 120 is -5, but I'm doing absolute values, so that'll be 5. 125 minus 120, also 5. So then down here, I take the sum of those. So 0 plus 5 plus 5, which gives me 10. Over here, in preparation for finding the standard deviation, I'm taking this column right here and I'm squaring it. Well, 0 squared is still 0. 5 squared is 25. 5 squared again, also 25. So add this column up and I have 50. So MAD value is when I take the sum, which we said was 10, and I divide it by how many data points there were, which was 3. So that's going to give me 3.333. Standard deviation is a little more complicated because it's got that square root. So my numerator is 50. My denominator, 3 minus 1, because there were 3 data points, so that's 2. So I get the square root of 25 here, which is 5. So we have calculated the standard deviation by hand. We've given kind of fancier notation to our calculation for MAD by hand. So anytime it asks you for these values, you could calculate them by hand. And the MAD we will continue to calculate by hand. However, standard deviation is a little more complicated. And when we get more and more data points, it becomes more and more difficult to calculate by hand, because if you have to make a chart like this every single time, you have to find the absolute deviation, then you have to square it, then you have to add all those up, then you have to divide, then you have to take the square root. I'm out of breath just saying all the steps. So it is much, much better to use our calculators to help us. So I had made a handout for you. Now, don't panic. We are not learning everything on that handout today. Today, we are just going to learn how to find the mean and standard deviation on our graphing calculator. We are not today going to look at what's at the bottom of this sheet. So, just the intro stuff. So, get out your calculators because we're going to try this together following along. And if you weren't in class for some reason, make sure you get one of these handouts. Obviously, you can see it on here, but you definitely want your own copy. So I've got some screenshots that I put on here just to help you along the way. So when we are calculating mean and standard deviation, obviously we're doing that based on data. So first thing that you want to do in your graphing calculator is clear any old data out of your lists. And I'm going to bring up my graphing calculator here, maybe. There we go. So just a reminder of how to do that. We go to Stat, and then we're going to choose choice 4. So Stat, choice 4 for clear list, and then you just name the lists you want to clear. So I'm just going to clear list 1 because we've only been using one list at a time. So I press second, and then 1, and then I press enter, and it says done. So list 1 should now be clear for me and ready. So this part should be super easy for you by now because we've done, entering data many times on your graphing calculator. So to enter, we're going to press stat and then choice 1. So stat, choice 1, and we're going to enter our data in list 1. So we are going to check our data with what we calculated in the data that they gave us here in the book. So we're going to use the data from number 5 since there are 4 data points there. So we're going to enter our 4 data points, which the first one was 7. So 7, enter, and then 10, then 8.1, and then 9.32. So these were our battery life, the 4 data things that we used right here in number 5. So again, we had said that the mean was 8.605 because the book had given us that value. So now we're going to be able to calculate that value on our own without having to do it by hand. Now again, for 4 pieces of data, not that hard. But most of the time that we're doing statistics, we're not working with 4 pieces of data. Companies are working with thousands of points of data. So very important to have, a calculator or computer system that's going to help you with the brunt of the work. So going back to my sheet here, we have our data entered. So then we're going to press stat again. And we're going to scroll right to highlight the calc menu. So I did a screenshot of that here. So we're going to press stat. We scroll right so that we get calc, and now my screen matches the screenshot over here. And then step 4 says press 1 because we're going to select one variable stats. That's what one var stands for. One variable because we only have one data list. So I press 1 to select that. Now, if you have a newer operating system, you're going to get this little prompt menu like I do where it says list. And you want to name whichever list contains your data. So list 1 definitely has my data, so I'm good to go there. If you have an older calculator, you're not going to see this prompt screen. You're just going to see, it'll go back to the home screen. And on that home screen, it's just going to say one var stats, essentially. So if you have the older model, you need to go ahead and type in L1 if that's where your data is. So press second and press 1. Obviously, I can do it here, but mine already said list 1. So if you have the home screen, instead of the prompt screen, your home screen is now going to say 1 var stats, and then you typed L1. So if you have that, go ahead and press enter. If you have this, scroll down to calculate and press enter. And lo and behold, look what it gives us. Here's X bar, that's the mean, and it does match what the book told us was the mean, so that's good. And then if I look a little bit closer, on the handout, I showed you what the results mean. So at least the important ones that you need to know. So X bar is the mean. Sample standard deviation is what we're after because this was a sample of values. It wasn't all the cell phone battery lives, it was just 4 of those batteries. So this capital S followed by the small x stands for sample standard deviation. And so its value there is, oh, it's not. I'm like, wait a second, it's not supposed to be 9. That's just on the handout. Oh my goodness. On the actual one, we can see that the sample standard deviation is 1.328 approximately, which if you look at what we wrote, 1.328. So what we calculated by hand and what the calculator does for us do match up. Now, it's also important that you know that this, which is actually the lowercase sigma Greek letter, the sigma x is what we call the population standard deviation. So at least in the next couple sections, we're not going to be using this calculation from our calculator, but we will need to know what that sigma stands for soon. So just so you know, that's a symbol used for standard deviation as well. It's just when it's the entire population rather than just a sample. And ours are all samples at this point, so we'll be using the SX. So again, we're not going to look at the rest of this handout today because that's for some later lessons, but we now know how to find the mean as well as the standard deviation on your calculator. That's important to save you some time. In your homework, if you look, as I scroll down here, it says calculate mean and standard deviation using a calculator or computer software. So it's okay with me if you don't show work if it specifically says to use the calculator. If it asks you just to calculate, then it probably wants you to do that by hand. Also, some of these just ask you for individual steps, which are important. So mean absolute deviation we're still going to do by hand. Notice here it says using technology, so that means in number 10 you can do that in your calculator. So all this table stuff you're going to do by hand, but you can use your calculator to get the others. All right, that is all for this lesson.